It is the middle of winter in a small English village, more than 700 years ago, and the light is going early. Snow lies grey and soft over the fields and the lanes, and over the low thatched roofs of the cottages, huddled together in the dark. From each roof, a thin thread of wood smoke rises straight into the still, cold air, and behind every shuttered window, a small fire is burning. And within those houses, the people are doing what they have done all through the dark months. They are eating, slowly and carefully, the food they put by for a winter that seems as though it will never end. Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Archive. Tonight we are going to drift, very gently, into a medieval winter, and into the question of what its people found to eat. Not the feasts of kings, and not the strange dishes of great lords, but the plain daily food of ordinary folk. The salted meat in the barrel, and the dark bread, and the slow pot of pottage by the fire. The cheese and the dried peas, and the small warm ale that carried a household through the cold. We will watch them kill, and salt their meat in the autumn, and bake their heavy bread, and count their stores, and at the very end, share their one bright feast in the deep of midwinter. None of it is urgent, none of it is loud. It is just history, told slowly, the way one winter must have followed another, for hundreds of quiet years. As always, there is nothing here you need to do. You don't have to follow the story, or hold the names, or stay awake until the end. If your thoughts begin to wander off into the dark, let them go. If you lose the thread, that is perfectly fine. This is the kind of telling you are allowed to fall asleep inside. So settle in. Let your shoulders sink down, away from your ears. Let the blankets feel heavier and warmer. Let your breathing slow and lengthen and soften. Whenever you are ready, close your eyes. Let's begin. Our winter begins, as the medieval winter so often did, with the killing of the beasts in the cold November yard. For there was a season for this, an old and fixed season, falling near the feast of St. Martin in the middle of November, and folk called it simply the killing time. By then the grass was gone, and the cold had come, and a farmer could no longer feed all his animals through the long months ahead. So the choice was made, as it was made every autumn, of which beasts would live and which would die. The breeding stock was kept, and a beast or two for the spring, but the rest were given to the knife, that their flesh might feed the household through the winter. Better to kill them now, while they were still fat from the autumn, than to let them grow thin and weak on what little fodder there was. In the yard of a small cottage, on a hard grey morning, the husbandman Aldwin stood waiting with his neighbour, the butcher Osbert, who came round the village to do this work. The frost lay white on the muddy ground, and their breath smoked in the cold, and a fat pig grunted and rooted, not yet knowing what the day would bring. A pig was the great standby of the poorer sort, for it cost little to keep, and ate scraps, and gave a wealth of meat and fat for its size. It was bloody, plain work, and no one made a show of it, but neither did they shrink from it. This was simply how the winter's meat was got, the way it had been got by their fathers and their fathers' fathers before them. A family that did its killing well and salted its meat with care would have flesh to eat through the dark months. A family that did not might go hungry. So Aldwin and the butcher set to their task in the cold yard, while the smoke of the fire pit rose grey into the still air. There was no haste and no cruelty beyond the need of it, only the steady doing of a thing that had to be done. And the killing time came round, as it always came, at the turning of the year toward the dark. When the work of the killing was done, the carcass was laid out upon the scrubbed wooden trestle to be made ready. It lay there pale and heavy in the grey light, and from it rose a faint warmth into the frosty air, the last warmth of a living thing. This was the beginning of the winter's larder, and every part of it would be used, for nothing so precious as meat could be allowed to go to waste. There is an old saying that of the pig, everything is used but the squeal, and in a medieval cottage, that was very nearly true. The flesh would be salted and stored, the fat would be saved for cooking and for light, the blood would be caught for puddings, and the bones would go into the pot. Even the bristles and the skin had their uses, and the offal, the heart and the liver and the rest, was eaten first of all, for it would not keep. The carcass on the trestle, then, was not a grim thing to these people, but a glad one, a sign of food secured against the cold. A household with a salted pig in its barrel could face the winter with some ease in its heart. A household without one faced it with dread. And so the pale, heavy shape on the boards was looked on with something close to satisfaction, the reward of a year's careful keeping. The frost glittered on the trestle's edge, and the knives lay ready, and the salt waited in its baskets nearby. A little way off, the fire pit smoked, where some of the meat would later be cured in the smoke as well as the salt. The whole yard was given over, this one day, to the turning of a living beast into a winter's worth of food. It was the oldest sort of work, this, older than the village, older than the church on the hill, the killing in the autumn, the saving against the cold, the long, slow eating down of the store through the dark. And it began here, with the carcass on the trestle, in the white and silent yard. Then came the careful breaking down of the carcass, and here the butcher's long skill was shown. Osbert worked with a broad knife and a heavy cleaver, his huge red hands sure and unhurried, parting the beast along its joints, as he had done 1,000 times before. He knew every seam of it, where the flesh divided, where the bone could be cut, and he wasted neither meat nor effort in the doing. The great sides were taken off first, the flitches that would be salted whole, and become the bacon of the winter. Then the hams, the heavy hind legs, prized above almost all the rest, to be salted hard and hung and eaten sparingly through the cold. The shoulders, the belly, the smaller cuts, each was set aside in its place, and the husbandman helped to carry and to hold as the work went on. It was cold out there, and the work was slow, and the men's breath hung white about their faces as they labored. But there was a quiet satisfaction in it, in the seeing of the great beast resolved into joints and sides, into the plain stuff of meals to come. Each cut laid by was a day or a week that the family would not go without flesh, and they reckoned it so as they worked. The poorer cuts and the trimmings would be eaten soon, in the first weeks, while they were fresh, for fresh meat was a rare treat and could not be kept. The better, larger pieces would be salted down and stored, to be brought out one by one through the long months, a little at a time, and the bones, when the meat was off them, would still give their goodness to many a pot of pottage before the spring. So the carcass became, under the butcher's hands, a winter's worth of food, sorted and set by. The husbandman looked on the laden trestle with a farmer's plain content, for here was much of his family's living for the dark months, and the cold sun crept low across the frosty yard, and the work went steadily on. While the men worked at the carcass, the goodwife Edith was busy too, for the saving of the lesser parts fell mostly to her. She came out into the cold yard with her bowls and her pots, her sleeves pushed up and her apron tied tight, to gather the things that must be used at once. For much of the beast would not keep, and what would not keep had to be made into food without delay, before it could spoil. First there was the blood, caught warm and stirred so it would not clot, to be made into the dark, rich puddings the people loved. Mixed with grain and fat and what herbs there were, and packed into the cleaned guts, it became a black pudding that could itself be kept a while. Nothing of the blood was thrown away, for it was good food, and food was never to be wasted in a world so near to hunger. Then there was the offal, the heart and the liver and the lights, the rich inward parts that would not last, and so were eaten first. These made the feast of the killing days, the one time of plenty in the lean turning of the year, eaten fresh and savoured while they could be. For a few days after the killing, even a poor house ate well, and the smell of frying liver and seething puddings filled the cottage. Edith worked quickly in the cold, her hands red and chapped, her breath smoking, carrying bowl after bowl to the warmth of the fire within. She rendered the fat down into lard, that pale soft grease that would cook their food and grease their pots through all the winter to come. She cleaned the guts for the puddings and the sausages, a long and unlovely task, but a needful one. It was busy, bloody, satisfying work, this making the most of the beast, and she went about it with a quiet care, for every scrap saved now was a mouthful that need not be wanted later, in the thin grey days at winter's end. And so she gathered, and rendered, and saved, and let nothing of the gift be lost. But the heart of the whole matter, the thing on which the winter's food truly turned, was the salting of the meat, for without salt the great sides and hams would have rotted within days, and all the killing would have been for nothing. Salt drew the water from the flesh, and held the spoiling at bay, and turned a perishable thing into food that would last for months. So Edith and Aldwin set to the salting together, in the cold of a lean-to by the cottage, where the meat would keep. They had their salt ready in baskets, grey and coarse, for salt was not cheap, and a household reckoned its cost as it reckoned its grain. Some of it was got from the salt makers by the sea or the brine springs, carried inland and bought dear, and used with a careful hand. They took the great flitches and the hams and rubbed the salt well into the flesh, working it deep into every part. It was important to leave no spot untouched, no fold or crevice where the salt did not reach, for there the meat would spoil and the rot would spread. So they rubbed and turned and rubbed again, their hands stinging where the salt found the cracks in their skin. It was patient work, and it could not be hurried, for the keeping of meat was a serious business, and a mistake was costly. A flitch badly salted might be lost altogether, and a lost flitch was a hard blow to a family that had little enough. So they took their time and did it well, the way they had been taught, the way it must be done. When the salt was rubbed in, the meat was set to lie a while, that the salt might draw and do its slow work. The lean-to smelled of salt and raw flesh and cold, a plain hard smell, the smell of a winter being made safe. And the two of them worked on in the dim light, salting their way toward the spring. In the corner of the lean-to stood the great salting trough and the row of wooden barrels, and these were the keeping place of the winter's meat. The trough was a long hollowed thing of timber, scrubbed clean, where the meat could lie packed in salt or steeped in brine. The barrels stood ready beside it, sound and dry, their staves tight, waiting to be filled and headed up and stored away. There were two great ways of keeping the meat with salt, and a careful household used both. The first was dry salting, packing the meat down in layers with dry salt between, so the salt drew the water out and the meat cured hard. The second was brining, sinking the meat in a strong salt water, a pickle so salty that an egg would float in it, where it could lie for months. The barrels, once filled and packed and closed, were a wealth in themselves, standing dark and heavy in the cold corner. Each held meat enough for many meals, and a family looked on its full barrels much as a richer man might look on a chest of coin. They were the difference between a winter of plain plenty and a winter of want, and they were guarded and counted accordingly. To open a barrel in the depth of winter and take out a piece of salted pork was to draw upon the work of the autumn. The meat came out pale and stiff and very salt, and it had to be soaked in fresh water, often overnight, to draw the worst of the salt away. Only then could it go into the pot, where it gave its strong cured savour to the pottage and the broth. So the trough and the barrels stood in their cold corner, plain and unlovely, holding the winter's living. There was no grandeur in them, only the deep, quiet comfort of food set safely by. And in the dark months to come, the family would come to them again and again, drawing out their winter from the salt. When the meat had taken its first salt and lain its time, it was packed down at last into the barrels for the long keeping. Edith and the butcher Osbert did this together, for it was heavy work and wanted doing right, lest the whole barrel be spoiled by a careless hand. They worked in the cold lean-to, layering the meat and the salt with care, pressing each layer down firm before the next was laid. A handful of salt across the bottom of the barrel first, then a layer of meat laid close, then salt again, and so on up. The salt had to be enough, and the meat had to be packed tight, with no air pockets where the rot might start and take hold. It was the same skill, in its way, as the salting itself, the patient excluding of all that might let the spoiling in. The butcher, who had done this in many a yard, showed the goodwife where she might do better, and she took the showing well. For there was no shame in learning the craft of keeping food, and much danger in doing it ill, and they all knew it. A barrel packed wrong might be opened in January to find the meat gone bad, and a household the poorer and hungrier for it. So they packed it down with care, layer on salted layer, until the barrel was full near to the brim. Then the head was set on and pressed, and the barrel was closed and rolled to its place in the cold corner with the rest. And there it would stand, dark and silent, its meat slowly curing through the weeks and the months of the dark. When at last the work was done, the lean-to held the winter's meat, salted and barreled and safe. The smell of salt and flesh hung in the cold air, and the row of full barrels stood like a quiet promise against hunger. And Edith looked on them with the deep plain content of a woman who knew her household would be fed. Not all the meat went into the barrels with the salt, for some was kept in another old way, hung up to dry and smoke. Under the eaves of the cottage, and up in the smoke of the rafters within, hung hams and flitches, and strings of sausages, slowly curing in the air. They darkened as the weeks went by, and grew firm and dry, and took on a deep savour from the wood smoke that drifted up to them. To hang a ham in the smoke of the fire was to cure it slowly, the smoke and the salt together, keeping the rot away. The constant low smoke of the cottage hearth, that blackened the beams and stung the eyes, did this useful work as it rose. And so the rafters of a winter cottage were often hung with meat, curing quietly overhead, while the family lived and ate below. There was something deeply reassuring in the sight of it, those dark shapes hanging in the smoky upper dark. A child looking up from the floor saw the winter's food hanging safe above, and a good wife glancing up counted her hams and was content. It was a wealth that could be seen, hung where the eye could find it, a plain reckoning of the family's store of flesh. The hanging meat would last the longest of all, drawn down only now and then, for a feast day or a hard time. A whole ham might hang for many weeks, darkening and drying, until at last it was taken down and soaked and boiled for some special day. It was the treasure of the meat store, kept back, eaten slow, made to last as far into the lean season as it could. So the killing time ended, and the autumn turned fully into winter, and the cottage hung heavy with its store of meat. Under the eaves and in the rafters, the hams and flitches cured in the smoke and the cold, waiting their turn through the dark, and the family, with their meat salted and hung and barreled, turned now to the plainer, daily business of bread and pottage, the food that filled the long months in between. Let us step now from the cold yard into the warm dark of the cottage, where the daily food was made. For all the salting and the storing, most of what a medieval family ate, day in and day out, was not meat at all, but bread and pottage. And both of these were made here, in this one low smoky room, at the open hearth that was the heart of the house. The hearth was a simple thing, a ring of stones in the middle of the earthen floor, where a fire burned low through all the year. Over it, on a chain or an iron bar, hung the great cauldron, the one large cooking pot that most poor houses had. And set into the wall nearby was the clay oven, domed and squat, where the bread was baked when there was baking to be done. The room was dim, lit chiefly by the fire, for windows were few and small, and stuffed against the cold. It smelled of wood smoke, and of whatever was in the pot, of damp earth, and of the herbs hung drying from the beams. The smoke rose and gathered under the roof, for there was no chimney, only a hole or a gap where it might find its slow way out. It was a humble kitchen, by any measure, this single pot and single oven in a single room. But from it came everything the family ate through the long winter days, the steady plain fare that kept body and soul together. There was no great variety in it, no dishes of many kinds, but there was warmth, and there was enough, and that was much. To us it might seem a poor and meagre way to cook, with one pot and a clay oven and an open fire. But it had fed the people of these islands for a very long time, and it would feed them for a long time yet. And so we settle by the hearth, in the warm, smoky dark, to watch the daily food being made. If there was one dish above all that the medieval poor lived upon, day after day, it was pottage. Pottage was the great standby, the thing that simmered in the cauldron over the fire from morning to night, and very often from one day to the next. It was a thick soup or a thin stew, made of whatever the household had, and there was almost always some of it on the go. Edith stood at the cauldron, stirring it slowly with a long wooden spoon, as she did many times a day. Into it went the grain first of all, oats or barley, to thicken it and give it body, and to make it stretch. Then went the peas and the beans from the store, and the greens, the cabbage, and the leeks, and the onions, and what herbs there were. And into the pottage too went the meat, when there was meat to spare, a little of the salted pork or a marrow bone, a scrap of bacon, a handful of dried peas, a few withered leaves of kale, all seethed slowly together in the one great pot. It was not a rich dish most days, but it was warm and filling, and it could be made of almost anything, and so it never failed. The beauty of pottage was that it was never quite finished and never quite begun. What was not eaten today simmered on for tomorrow, and to it was added a little more grain, a few more greens, whatever came to hand. And so the pot went on, day after day, week after week, the same and yet always a little different, the long unbroken meal of the winter. There was a deep comfort in that steady pot, always there, always warm, always giving up its plain goodness. A child came in cold from the snow and was given a bowl of it. A man came in tired from the wood and was given the same, and the cauldron hung over the fire, steaming gently, the patient heart of the cottager's eating, all the winter long. Let us look a moment longer at that cauldron, hanging dark and round over the low red fire. It was iron, most likely, a heavy thing, and it was one of the most valued objects a poor family owned, for it could not easily be replaced. A good cooking pot was a thing handed down, mended when it cracked, prized and looked after, for without it there could be no pottage at all. It hung on its chain or its hook above the flames, and the fire was tended to keep it at a slow and steady seethe. Too fierce a fire would burn the pottage to the bottom, too low a fire would let it go cold and flat. So the good wife judged the fire by long habit, feeding it a stick here, raking it there, keeping the pot at its gentle simmer. The steam rose from it in a slow, soft cloud, carrying the smell of the day's pottage through the little room. On a good day, that smell was rich, of bacon and onions and herbs. On a lean day, it was thin, of grain and water and not much else. But there was almost always some smell of cooking in the cottage, and to come in from the cold to it was a small daily joy. The cauldron did more than make pottage too, for it was the only large vessel many houses had. In it, the salted meat was boiled, and the dried peas softened, and the puddings cooked, and sometimes the very water heated for washing. It was the one great workhorse of the kitchen, in use from dawn till dark, never long off the fire. So it hung there, steaming, blackened with years of smoke, the plain, dependable center of the household's food. There was nothing fine about it, nothing to admire, only its long, faithful usefulness, day after winter day, and the family gathered to it, bowl in hand, to take their share of what it slowly made. Bread and pottage both began with grain, and before grain could be cooked or baked, it had often to be ground. In the corner of the cottage stood the hand quern, two round flat stones, the lower fixed and the upper turned by a wooden handle. Between them the grain was crushed to meal, and this was the daily labor of the women of the house, slow and wearisome, and never quite done. Edith set the boy Hodge to help her at it on this morning, for it was good for a child to learn the work early. She poured a handful of grain into the hole in the upper stone and showed him how to turn it, round and round, while she fed in more. The stones rumbled and ground, and the pale meal sifted out at the edges and gathered on the cloth spread beneath. It was hard work, the grinding, and it took a long time to make even enough for the day's needs. The arms ached, and the back ached, and the same dull turning went on and on, round and round, until the grain was meal. Yet it had to be done, for there was no other way in a poor house to have flour for the bread and the pottage. In the village there was a mill, of course, the Lord's mill, where grain could be ground in greater quantity by water or by wind. But the miller took his share for the grinding, a portion of every load, and many a poor family ground at home to save it. So the hand quern turned in the cottage corner, and the meal was made by aching arms, a little each day, as it had been for ages. The boy soon tired of the turning, as boys do, and his arms grew slow, and Edith took it up again herself. But he had learned a little of the labor that lay behind every loaf and every bowl of pottage he had ever eaten, and the quern ground on, and the meal gathered, slow and pale, on the cloth beneath the stones. When the meal was ground, and the dough was made and baked, it became bread, and the bread of the poor was dark and heavy and brown. It was not the fine white bread of the rich, made of sifted wheat, but a coarse dark loaf of rye, or of rye and wheat mixed, which folk called maslin, and it was eaten at nearly every meal, the steady foundation of the diet, the very word for food and for life itself. The dark loaves cooled now on a shelf by the wall, round and flat and heavy, their crusts thick and hard. They were dense, these loaves, close-grained and chewy, nothing like the light bread we know, but they were filling, and they kept well. A loaf of maslin or rye would last for days, growing harder as it aged, until at last it was hard enough to grate or to soak. The grain that went into the bread was whatever the family grew or could get, and it was rarely fine wheat alone. Rye grew well in poor cold soil where wheat would not, and barley too, and these dark grains made the bread of the common folk. Mixed together as maslin, or eaten as plain rye, they gave a bread that was dark and sour and strong and very far from white. There was a whole ladder of bread in those days, from the fine white manchet of the Lord's table down to the coarsest bran loaf of the poor. A man's bread told you his place in the world, and the dark heavy loaf was the bread of the labourer and the cottager, but it was honest bread, and good, and it filled the belly, and it was the daily bread that the people truly lived on. So the dark loaves cooled on the shelf, and the smell of fresh baking, rare and welcome, filled the little room. They would be eaten with the pottage, and with a little cheese, and a scrap of salted meat, the plain meals of the winter, and the family looked on them, those heavy brown rounds, as the surest sign that they would not go hungry that day. The baking of the bread was not a daily thing in a poor house, but a labour done now and then, in some quantity at once, for it took fuel to heat the oven, and fuel was precious, so the good wife baked a batch of loaves together and made them last. Edith heated the little domed clay oven set in the wall, building a fire within it and letting it burn until the clay was hot through. When the oven was hot enough, she raked out the ashes and the embers and swept it clean, and judged the heat by long practice. There was no measuring of it, no looking at a dial, only the old skill of the hand and the eye, the holding of a hand near the mouth. Too cool, and the bread would be heavy and raw. Too hot, and the crust would burn before the inside was done. Then in went the shaped loaves, set on the hot floor of the oven, and the mouth was closed and sealed to hold the heat. And there they baked, in the falling warmth of the spent fire, while the smell of baking bread crept out into the room. That smell was one of the good smells of the cottage, rich and warm and deep, and it told the whole house that bread was coming. Not every house had even its own oven, and in many a village the bread was baked at a common oven, or at the Lord's. There too a fee was due, a portion, or a payment, for the Lord held the oven as he held the mill, and took his share of both. But a cottage, with its own little clay oven, could bake its own dark bread, and many did, when they could spare the fuel. So the loaves baked, and the heat ebbed slowly from the clay, and at last the bread was drawn out, dark and hard-crusted and done. It was set to cool, and the oven was let go cold, and the precious fuel was not wasted again until the next baking day. And the family had bread once more, enough to last them, a small sure store against the days to come. For larger grindings, the village folk went to the mill, and so let us walk a little way through the snow to see it. The mill stood by the stream at the edge of the village, its great wheel turning slowly in the cold water, its stones grinding within. And here worked Wat the miller, a stout floury man, grinding the grain of the village into meal, and taking his fee for the doing. The mill was a busy place, even in winter, for grain had always to be ground, and the Lord's mill was where much of it was done. The water turned the wheel, and the wheel turned the great millstones, and between them the grain was crushed far faster than any hand could do it. A man could bring a sack of grain and carry home a sack of meal, the work of many hours at home, done here in a fraction of the time. But the miller took his toll, a portion of every grinding, and millers were not much loved for it. There was an old suspicion of the miller, a sense that he took more than his due, that his thumb was heavy on the scale. Fairly or not, the miller in the old tales was often a sly and grasping man, and the folk watched their meal carefully as he measured. Yet the mill was a wonder all the same, a great machine of wood and stone, harnessing the water to do the labor of many backs. What moved among the turning stones in his flower-grey clothes, his face and hair white with the dust of his trade, sure-footed amid the rumble? He knew his stones, and how to set them close or wide, and how to keep the meal coming fine and even. So the village brought its grain to the mill, and carried home its meal, and the miller took his share, and all went on as it always had. The wheel turned in the cold stream, and the stones ground, and the snow lay white on the mill's mossy roof, and the meal that came from it became, in the cottages, the bread and the pottage that the people ate. At the day's chief meal, the family gathered at the rough plank table to eat their bread and their pottage together. It was not a grand meal, nor a long one, but it was the steady center of the day, the plain food that kept them going. Aldwin came in from his work, and the boy from his, and they sat to the board where Edith had set out the bowls. There were wooden bowls of the steaming pottage, and the dark bread, cut in thick slabs, and perhaps a little cheese or a scrap of meat. They ate with wooden spoons and with their fingers, for forks were unknown to such folk, and the bread itself served as a spoon and a plate. A piece of hard bread, soaked in the pottage, sopped up the broth and was eaten, and so nothing of the meal was lost. There was little talk at the eating, for they were hungry and tired, and the food was there to be eaten, not lingered over. But there was a quiet ease in it, this sitting together in the warm room, the pot's warmth in the bowl, the bread in the hand. The cold was outside, beyond the door, and here was warmth and food, and the company of one's own, and that was enough. It was the same meal, near enough, day after day, all through the winter, and the people did not weary of it as we might. For they had known no other, and they were glad of it, and a full bowl of pottage and a hunk of bread was a good thing on a cold day. Variety was for the rich, for the poor there was sufficiency, and on a good winter day sufficiency was a kind of plenty. So they ate, the husbandman and the goodwife and the boy, in the smoky firelit room, and were filled and were warmed. The bowls were scraped clean, and the bread was finished, and the pot hung steaming for the next meal to come. And the plain daily round of the cottage's eating turned, as it turned every day, toward the night. So went the daily round of food in the medieval cottage, a slow and steady cycle, repeated through all the winter days. There was no breakfast as we might think of it, often, but bread and perhaps a little ale to start the cold morning. Then the work of the day, and the chief meal toward the middle of it, and a lighter bite again toward the dark. Edith was at the center of it all, as the good wife always was, for the feeding of the household was her great charge. She tended the pot, and ground the meal, and baked the bread, and judged the stores, and saw that all were fed. It was unending work, this feeding of a family from a single pot and a clay oven, and it filled her days from dark to dark. The boy Hodge was her helper and her shadow, fetching and carrying, turning the quern, watching and learning the ways of the kitchen. For a cottage child learned the work of survival early, not in any school, but at the side of the parents, by doing. He learned how the pottage was made, and how the bread was baked, and how the stores must last, without ever being taught it as a lesson. There was a rhythm to it that was almost restful in its sameness, the same tasks at the same hours, day after day, the fire tended, the pot stirred, the bread cut, the bowls filled and emptied and filled again, the slow turning of the household's eating. It asked no thought after a while, only the doing, the long patient doing of the things that kept them alive. And so the days of the deep winter went by, in the warm smoky cottage, around the steaming pot and the dark bread. It was a plain life and a hard one, but it had its comforts, and food enough, with care, was among the chief of them. We will leave the cottage hearth now, and go to see where all this food was kept, in the cold larder and the cellar below. Behind and below the cottage lay the larder and the cellar, the cold, quiet places where the winter's food was stored. For all that was eaten had first to be kept, and the keeping of food was a craft as careful as the cooking of it, and as needful. A family that stored its food well would eat through the winter. A family that stored it ill would find its stores spoiled and itself in want. The larder was a cool lean-to or a shadowed corner, kept as cold as might be, for cold kept the food from spoiling. And the cellar, where there was one, was a dug place in the earth, cool and dark and even in its temperature through all the year. Down there the cold of the ground itself preserved what was kept, a natural coldness that asked no fuel and never failed. To step into the cold store was to step into a still and shadowed room where the breath hung faintly white in the dim light. On the shelves stood crocks and pots. On the floor stood sacks and barrels. From the beams hung bundles and strings of food. It was a plain place and a cold one, but it was a treasure house all the same, holding the whole winter's living. For the medieval family could not, like us, go and buy more food when the store ran low. What they had was what they had gathered and made and put by, and when it was gone until the spring. So the cold store was the very citadel of the winter, the place where survival was kept, and it was tended and counted with the greatest care. We have seen the meat, salted and hung. Now let us look at the rest of what was kept here against the cold. The dried peas and beans, the salted and dried fish, the cheese and the butter, the roots and the apples in their straw. For these humble things, far more than any meat, were what truly carried the poor through the long dark months. Of all the stored foods, none was more important to the poor than the dried peas and beans, the pulses of the field. For meat was scarce, and bread took grinding and baking, but a sack of dried peas could be kept easily and cooked simply, and it fed many. So the cottage cellar held its sacks of them, grey and hard and dry, the plain protein that filled out the winter pottage. Edith came down to the cellar to check the sacks, opening them and running her hand through the dry, hard pulses within. She judged how much was left, and how long it must last, and whether any had taken damp or been got at by the mice. For a sack of peas gone bad was a real loss, and a careful goodwife watched her stores against spoiling and against vermin alike. Dried peas and beans were the great keeping food, for once dried, they lasted near indefinitely, asking only to be kept dry. Soaked overnight and seethed long in the pot, they softened into a thick mush, filling and nourishing, that stretched the pottage far. Peas pottage, made of little but peas and water and a scrap of bacon, was the very type of poor men's food, plain and grey and good. There is an old rhyme about peas pottage, hot and cold and in the pot 9 days old, and it tells a truth of the winter table. For the peas were cooked in quantity and kept, and eaten and reheated and added to, day after day, the same as the pottage itself. They were the cheapest of fillings, and the surest, and the most patient, and they asked little and gave much. So the sacks of peas and beans stood in the cellar corner, plain and unregarded, holding much of the winter's nourishment. There was no glamour in them, no savour to speak of, only their long faithful keeping and their plain filling goodness. And Edith, having counted them and found them sufficient, climbed back up to the warmth, content that her family would be fed. Along one wall of the cold store stood the barrels of salted fish, and on a rack hung the split dried fish, stiff and pale. For fish was a great part of the winter diet, more than we might think, and not only by the sea, but far inland as well. The church bade folk eat fish on many days, the fast days and the long weeks of Lent, when meat was forbidden, and so fish was always wanted. The commonest was the herring, that little silver fish caught in great shoals and preserved in vast numbers against the winter. Salted down in barrels, or smoked into red herring, or dried, it kept for months, and it was cheap, and it fed the poor in their millions. A barrel of salt herring in the cellar was a winter's worth of fish, eaten through Lent and beyond, plain and strong and salty. And there was the dried cod, the stockfish, hard as a board, that kept for years, and was beaten and soaked soft before cooking. Carried far inland from the northern seas, it was a strange hard food, but a lasting one, and it gave fish to folk who lived nowhere near the sea. Soaked long and seethed, it gave up its plain savour into the pottage, a fish meal on a meatless day. The keeping of fish, like the keeping of meat, was all in the salt and the drying and the smoke. Take the water out, or lock it away with salt, and the fish would not spoil. Leave it fresh, and it was gone in a day. So the fish of the summer seas became the food of the winter cottage, salted and dried and barrelled, far from where it swam. To eat salt fish through the long weeks of Lent was no great pleasure, in truth, and folk grew weary of it before the spring. But it was food, and lawful food on the fast days, and it filled the belly when the meat was forbidden or run low. So it hung pale and stiff on its rack, and stood barrelled in its brine, waiting its turn at the winter table. Among the most prized of all the stored foods were the cheese and the butter, made from the milk of the warmer months. For in summer the cows and the ewes gave milk in plenty, far more than could be drunk, and so it was turned into things that would keep. And of these, hard cheese and salted butter were the chief, packed away in the cold store to feed the family through the winter. Edith and Aldwyn came down together to take stock of the cheese and the butter, counting their store with care. The cheeses stood in rounds upon the shelves, hard and yellow and aging, some young and some kept long and grown sharp and dry. A hard cheese, made carefully, would keep for many months, growing ever harder and stronger, a lasting store of the summer's milk. Cheese was the meat of the poor, in a way, for it was rich and filling, and gave the goodness that flesh gave, and it kept. A wedge of hard cheese with a hunk of dark bread was a meal in itself. The dinner a man carried to the fields, plain and sustaining. And the poorer, harder cheeses, made of skimmed milk, were so hard that they were near indestructible, and lasted the longest of all. The butter, too, was made in summer, and kept against the winter, salted hard to preserve it, and packed down in crocks. Salt butter was strong stuff, but it kept, and it gave fat and savour to the pottage and the bread when little else would. A crock of salted butter in the cellar was a comfort, a richness held in reserve for the lean and meatless days. So the cheese and the butter stood in the cold store, the milk of summer kept solid against the cold of winter. They were a quiet wealth, these pale rounds and packed crocks, the gift of the green months held safe through the white. And the family counted them, and were glad of them, and climbed back up to the fire, with the day's portion in hand. In the darkest, coolest corner of the cellar lay the roots and the apples, bedded carefully in dry straw to keep them through the cold. For the autumn had given its harvest of these too, and they were stored away with care, that they might last as long as they could. There were turnips and parsnips and onions, and leeks and cabbages, and the precious store of apples, the fruit of the year kept against the dark. The roots kept well in the cool dark, packed in straw or sand, away from the frost that would spoil them, and the warmth that would rot them. Parsnips and turnips and the like were the vegetables of the winter, going into the pottage to give it body and a little sweetness. And the onions and the leeks hung in their strings or lay in their baskets, the savour of many a winter dish. The apples were the treasure of the store, the only fruit that would keep, laid out so that none touched another, on shelves or in straw. For one bad apple would spoil its neighbours, and so they were laid apart, and looked over often, and the spoiling ones taken out. A good store of apples, kept so, would last well into the winter, a rare sweetness in a diet of grain and salt and grey. To bite into a stored apple in the depth of winter was to taste the autumn again, a little wrinkled, a little soft, but sweet still. The children especially loved them, and they were doled out with care, for they would not last forever, and the want of them was long. Some too were made into cider, or cooked, or dried in rings, the better to keep the goodness of the orchard through the cold. So in the straw-bedded corner lay the roots and the fruit, the green and growing things of the year, kept dormant against the dark. They gave the winter table what little freshness it had, a turnip in the pot, an apple in the hand, a leek in the broth, and they waited there, cool and dark and patient, for their turn to be carried up to the warm and hungry house. Each day, someone went down to the cold store to fetch up what the household would eat, and often it was Edith with the boy. Down the few steps into the dim, cool dark they went, with a basket or a bowl, to take the day's portion from the winter's store. A measure of peas, a piece of salt fish, a wedge of cheese, a few roots, perhaps a little of the precious meat, carried up to the fire. It was a small daily ritual, this fetching of the food, but it was the very pulse of the winter household. For the cold store was the larder, and the warm cottage was the kitchen, and the few steps between them were walked each day. A little was taken at a time, never too much, for what was carried up must be cooked and eaten before it could spoil in the warmth. Edith taught the boy, as they fetched, the great lesson of the winter store, that it must be made to last. She showed him how to judge a portion, how to keep something always in reserve, how to read the dwindling of the sacks and the shelves. For the worst peril of the winter was not the cold alone, but the slow shadow of hunger that came when the stores ran low too soon. So she took, each day, what was needed and no more, and left the rest, and the store went down slowly, as it should. A household that ate freely in the early weeks would starve in the late ones. A household that rationed from the start would come through. This was the deep arithmetic of survival, the counting of food against days, made and remade all through the dark months. The boy carried the basket up the steps into the warm room, where the pot hung steaming and the fire glowed low. He had learned a little more of the careful keeping that lay behind every meal, the long foresight that fed them through the cold, and the day's food was set by the hearth, ready for the pot, drawn up once more from the patient store below. From the beams of the larder hung the strings of onions and the bundles of dried herbs, and these were the seasoning of the winter. For the food of the poor was plain, but it need not be wholly without savour, and a few herbs and onions did much to lift it. So they were gathered in the warm months, and dried and hung, to give their flavour to the long grey meals of the cold. The onions hung in their plaited strings, and the garlic too, and these went into nearly every dish, the great base of all the cooking. An onion seethed in the pottage gave it depth and savour where there was little else, and so onions were grown and stored in plenty. They kept well, hung dry in the cool air, and were used freely, the one strong flavour that even the poorest house could have. And there were the herbs, gathered from the garden and the hedgerow, and dried in bunches against the beams. There was parsley and sage and thyme, and others whose names are half forgotten now, the pot herbs of the medieval kitchen. They gave their savour to the pottage and the meat, and some too were thought to give health, for food and medicine were not always parted then. The drying and hanging of these things was the good wife's careful work, done in the summer for the sake of the winter. She knew which herbs to gather, and when, and how to dry them, so they kept their savour, and how to use them in the pot. It was a knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, the lore of the kitchen garden and the cooking fire, old and unwritten. So the onions and the herbs hung in the cool dark, giving the larder its mingled scent of earth and savour and dust. They were small things, these, in the great matter of survival, but they were what made the plain food bearable, day after day. And a pinch of dried herb, or a seethed onion, brought a little of the green summer into the grey pottage of the winter. There was one more care that fell to the household over its winter stores, and that was the guarding of them against loss. For the food was a wealth, the most needful wealth of all, and there were many things that might take it, damp and rot, and above all, vermin. So Aldwin saw to the store as carefully as his wife, mending the walls and the doors, keeping out the mice and the rats and the wet. The mice and the rats were the great enemy, forever seeking the grain and the peas and the cheese, gnawing into sacks and crocks. A family's cat earned its keep here, hunting the vermin in the cold store, and was valued for it, for the loss the mice could do was real. A sack of grain left open, a cheese left within reach, might be ruined in a night, and so the store was kept close and watched. Damp was the other foe, for damp brought rot and mould, and could spoil in a week what had taken a season to lay by. So the store was kept dry as could be, the roof sound, the floor raised where it might be, the sacks set up off the cold ground, and things were looked over often, turned and checked, the spoiling found and taken out before it could spread to the rest. It was a constant low labour, this guarding of the food, but it was as needful as the gathering of it had been. For what use was a full larder in November if half of it was lost to rot and mice by February, when it was most wanted? So the store was tended like a living thing, watched and kept and defended, all through the dark months. Aldwin checked the doors and the walls, and set the cat to its work, and saw that all was sound against the night. The winter's food stood safe in its cold, dark places, guarded against the many small thieves of the season, and the family could rest a little easier, knowing their store was kept, their living defended, their winter secured. Now let us turn from food to drink, for the medieval winter was warmed not only by fire, but by ale, and ale must be brewed. In a cottage at the village edge worked Maud the alewife, for the brewing of ale was often women's work, and a good wife might brew for sale. And there she stood, over her great copper vat and her wooden mash tub, making the small ale that the whole village drank. For ale was not a luxury in those days, but a daily drink, taken by everyone, by men and women and children alike. The water was often not safe to drink, and so ale, weak and small, was the common drink, brewed weak enough to quench thirst all day. This small ale had little strength in it, and was drunk by all in great quantity, the plain liquid of the medieval table. Maud's brewhouse was warm and steamy, full of the smell of malt and yeast, a close and pleasant fug against the cold outside. The fire burned beneath the vat, and the steam rose, and the sacks of malted barley stood ready, and the casks waited to be filled. It was hard, hot work, the brewing, lifting and stirring and straining, but it was good work too, and it gave her a living. The alewife was a figure in every village, for someone had to brew the ale, and it was often she who did it. She hung a bush or an ale stake over her door, to show that she had ale to sell, and the folk came to her to buy or to drink. Some alewives were honest, and some were not, and there were laws and inspectors to see that the measure was full and the ale was good. So Maud stood at her vat in the warm, steamy room, making the drink that warmed and cheered the whole village through the winter. It was an old craft, the brewing, older than memory, and women had done it in their cottages since long before, and the smell of the malt and the murmur of the fire filled the brewhouse as the ale slowly came to be. Let us watch the brewing more closely, for it was a craft with its own steps and skills, patient and old. It began with the malt, the barley that had been let to sprout and then dried, which made the sweetness from which the ale was made. This malt was crushed and put into the wooden mash tub, and hot water was poured over it, and there it steeped and worked. The hot water drew the sweetness from the malt, making a sweet brown liquid that the brewers called the wort. This wort was drawn off, and the malt might be steeped again for a weaker second brew, and so the small ale was made from the last of it. For the first strong wort made the better ale, and the later weaker wort made the small ale, the daily drink of the common folk. Then the wort was boiled in the great copper vat, over the fire, steaming and bubbling, while the brewer watched and tended it. In later times they added hops to it, for flavour and for keeping, but the old ale was often brewed without, or with other herbs. The boiling done, the wort was cooled, and then the yeast was added, the living thing that would turn the sweet wort into ale. It was the yeast that did the deep magic of the brewing, working in the cooling wort, turning its sweetness into ale over days. The brewer kept her yeast from one brewing to the next, a precious living thing, the seed of all her ale, guarded and renewed. And in the working wort, slowly, the ale came to be, foaming and murmuring in the tub, becoming the drink of the village. So the vat and the mash tub stood steaming in the warm brewhouse, the great vessels of the alewife's craft. The malt steeped, the wort boiled, the yeast worked, and the ale slowly made itself under the brewer's watchful eye. And the steam rose, and the smell of brewing filled the room, sweet and yeasty and warm against the winter cold. When the ale had worked and was ready, it was strained and run off into the casks, to settle and clear and be drunk. Maud strained the new ale from the lees, the spent yeast and the dregs, and filled her wooden casks and her earthenware jugs. The ale was cloudy yet, and would clear a little as it stood, but it was not kept long, for old ale soon went sour. For this was the great difference between the old ale and the drink we know. It did not keep, but had to be brewed often and drunk fresh. Without hops, the ale soured within days or a week or two, and so a household or an alewife brewed little and often, all the year round. There was always brewing to be done, always a fresh batch coming on, for the ale once made was soon drunk or soon spoiled. Maud filled her casks and set them by, and stoppered her jugs, ready for the folk who would come to buy. The fresh ale was the best, sweet and lively, and folk knew when an alewife had brewed, and came for their share while it was good. A cask of new ale was a welcome thing in the winter, and word went round the village when Maud's bush was out, and her ale was ready. The casks stood in a cool corner, dark and round, holding the village's drink, the daily liquid of every table. Some would be sold by the jug to those who came, and some drunk at the alewife's own settle, where folk gathered to drink and talk. And so the ale went from the vat to the cask to the cup, fresh brewed and soon drunk, the warm small ale of the winter. It was a humble drink, the small ale, weak and plain and quickly made, nothing like the strong brews of later days. But it was the drink of the people, taken at every meal, by every soul, the safe and cheering liquid of the medieval day. And the alewife brewed it, and casked it, and sold it, fresh and often, all the winter through. In the warm front room of the alewife's cottage stood a long settle and a trestle, where folk came to sit and drink. For the alewife's house was a kind of gathering place, a forerunner of the inn, where a man might come of an evening to take his ale. And on a cold winter night, the warm room and the fresh ale and the company drew the village folk in from the dark. Aldwin the husbandman came in one evening, stamping the snow from his feet, glad of the warmth and the light and the ale. Maud drew him a cup of her fresh ale, and he sat on the settle by the fire, and drank, and warmed himself, and talked a while. It was one of the small pleasures of the winter, this, the warm room and the cup and the easy talk of neighbours. The talk was of the plain things, of the weather and the beasts and the work, of how the winter went and how the stores held. There was no hurry in it and no great matter, only the slow, comfortable talk of folk who had known each other all their lives. And the ale went round, and the fire burned, and the cold and the dark were shut outside for an hour or two. The alewife's settle was a warm, bright spot in the winter village, a place to come in from the cold and be among others. For the winter could be a lonely time, shut up in one's cottage against the weather, and the chance to gather was welcome. A cup of ale by a stranger's fire, a word with a neighbour, was a small warmth of the spirit as well as of the body. So Aldwin drank his ale, and talked his fill, and at last rose to go back out into the cold, and home to his own fire. He left a coin or a token for the ale, and pulled his hood close, and stepped out into the snowy dark. And behind him the warm room glowed on, and the ale went round, and the settle by the fire stayed full a while yet. Let us look a moment at the brewhouse store, the casks and the jugs that held the village's drink. They stood in the cool back room, the wooden casks dark and bound with hoops, the earthenware jugs glazed and stoppered. Not so great a store as the food, for the ale did not keep and could not be hoarded, but a working store, always turning over. For the brewing was a constant thing, a fresh batch always coming on, and so the casks were always emptying and filling, A cask drunk down was sent back to be cleaned and filled again, and the cycle never stopped, all the year round. The alewife's wealth was not in a great hoard of ale, but in the steady making and selling of it, batch after batch. The vessels themselves were valued things, the casks and the jugs and the mugs, the gear of the brewing trade. A good cask was costly, and was kept clean and sound and mended, for sour ale clung to a dirty cask and spoiled the next brew. So Maud kept her vessels scoured and sweet, scalding them clean between the brewings, that her ale might stay good. The earthenware mugs and jugs were the everyday cups, plain and brown, from which the folk drank their ale. There was little of glass or fine ware in such a place, only the honest pottery of the country, made by the local potter. And from these plain brown cups the village drank its small ale, day after day, meal after meal, all the winter long. So the casks and jugs stood in the cool store, the turning wealth of the alewife, the vessels of the village's drink. There was no grandeur in them, only their plain usefulness, the holding and the pouring of the daily ale. And they emptied, and were filled, and emptied again, in the long, unbroken round of the brewing. On the coldest nights, the ale was not drunk cold from the cask, but warmed at the fire, and sometimes spiced against the chill. For there was nothing so comforting on a bitter night as a cup of warm ale, the heat of it spreading through the cold body. And Maud, like many a good wife, knew how to warm and spice the ale, to make a drink that cheered and thawed at once. She would take the poker, heated red-hot in the fire, and plunge it hissing into the cup of ale to warm it through. The ale steamed and frothed at the hot iron, and grew warm, and the smell of it rose richer in the heat, malty and sweet. It was a simple trick, the hot poker in the ale, but it made the cold drink into a warm and welcome one. And on better days, or for a better occasion, the ale might be spiced, with what spices a household could afford or find. Spices were dear, brought from far away, and the poor saw little of them, but a good wife might keep a little for a special time. A little ginger, or a few seeds, or some honey to sweeten, warmed into the ale, made a rich and cheering drink for a cold night. This warm spiced ale was a comfort and a medicine both, in the minds of the people, good against the cold and the chills of winter, for they did not always part the warming of the body from the healing of it, and a hot spiced drink was thought to do both. So a cup of it was given to one who came in chilled, or one who felt the start of a winter ague, to warm and to mend. So Maud warmed and spiced the ale on the cold nights, by the brewhouse fire, and the smell of it was rich and good. It was the small luxury of the winter, this warm spiced cup, a little richness in the long plain cold, and it cheered the heart as it warmed the body, the best of comforts on the bitterest of nights. One cold evening, Aldwin and the boy came in from the wood, chilled to the bone, and were given warm ale by the fire. The husbandman had a cup of Maud's warm spiced ale, and the boy a little of the small ale, warmed, weak enough for a child. And they sat by the fire and drank, and felt the warmth spread through them, and the cold of the day began to leave their bones. For children too drank ale, in those days, small weak ale, watered and mild, for it was safer than the water and gave them strength. There was no thought that it was wrong, for the small ale was a food as much as a drink, and the children had always had it. So the boy drank his warm cup and was glad of it, and the colour came back to his chapped cheeks by the fire. The warm ale did its quiet work, easing the chill, lifting the spirits, making the cold seem a little farther off. There was a deep comfort in a warm drink on a cold night, a comfort old as fire itself, the body thawing from within, and father and son sat together in the warmth, drinking, saying little, content to be in from the cold. It was one of the plain pleasures of the winter, this, the coming in from the cold to warmth and a warm drink. The harder the day outside, the sweeter the warmth within, and a cup of warm ale was the very taste of shelter and rest. So they savoured it, the man and the boy, the long day's cold giving way to the fire's warmth and the ales. When the cup was done and the warmth was in them, they rose and made ready to go home through the snow. The warm ale had thawed them and cheered them, and the walk home seemed less hard for the warmth they carried within. And out they went into the cold and the dark, warmed against it, toward their own fire and their own beds. And sometimes the ale was carried home, in a jug, to be drunk by the cottage fire with the evening meal. Edith went to the alewife's with her jug, and had it filled with the fresh small ale, and carried it home through the snow. For a household that did not brew its own would buy its ale from the alewife, a jugful at a time, as it was needed. She walked home carefully through the snowy lane, the jug held close, the ale within it the family's drink for the day or two. The cold bit at her, and the snow crunched underfoot, and the smoke of the cottages rose grey into the failing light. But the jug was full, and there would be ale with the supper, and that was a small good thing to carry home. For the ale was part of the meal, taken with the bread and the pottage, the liquid of the table, drunk by all. A meal without ale would have seemed a poor and thirsty thing, and so the jug was filled and brought home and set on the board. It was no great quantity and no great strength, but it was the daily drink, and a household reckoned on having it. So Edith carried her jug home through the snow, as she did every few days, fetching the family's drink as she fetched its food. It was one more of the small errands of the winter, the going out into the cold to bring back what the household needed. And she was glad to come in at last to the warm cottage and set down the jug and feel the fire on her cold face. The ale was poured out at supper into the plain brown cups and drunk with the bread and the pottage by the fire. It was a humble drink and a humble meal, but it was warm and it was enough, and the family ate and drank together. And so the matter of drink, like the matter of food, was seen to, and the household had its ale through the winter. But now the winter wore on, and the days that had seemed so well stocked began, slowly, to show their bottom. For there came a time, in the late winter and the early spring, that folk knew and feared, and called the hungry gap. It was the lean time, the thin time, when the stores of autumn were near spent, and the new food of spring had not yet come. We have seen the larder full, in the early winter, the barrels of meat, the sacks of peas, the rounds of cheese. but all of it had been eaten down, day by day, week by week, and now, as the winter dragged toward its end, it was running low. The shelves stood half bare, the sacks near empty, the barrels light, and there was still a long way to go before the spring. This was the great peril of the medieval year, the gap between the old food and the new, when hunger came closest. The autumn's harvest was gone or nearly gone, the spring's first food, the new greens and the early growth, was not yet ready. And in between lay these weeks of want, when a family ate thin and sparing, and looked anxiously toward the lengthening days. In Edith's cottage, now, the larder told the tale, its shelves grown bare, its store grown small, its plenty gone. The good meat was mostly eaten. What was left was the poorest and the saltiest. The peas were low, the cheese was down to ends, and the good wife, who had counted and rationed so carefully, now counted with a tighter and more anxious hand. For this was the test of all the autumn's care, whether the store, eked out through the winter, would last until the spring. A family that had stored well and rationed well might come through the hungry gap, thin but whole. One that had not might truly starve. And so the late winter was the hardest season of all, the lean grey time, when the food ran short and the spring seemed far. The pottage in the hungry gap grew thin, for there was less to put in it, and it had to be stretched ever further. Edith stirred the pot, as ever, but it was a poorer pot now, more water and grain, and less of anything else. The meat was scarce, the peas were low, the good things were going, and the pottage grew grey and thin and plain. There was still the grain, the barley, and the oats to thicken it, and that was much, for grain was the last to fail. And there were the dregs of the peas, and a few withered roots, and a scrap of the saltiest meat, all seethed long together. But it was a thin gruel now, more than a stew, and a body rose from it less filled than it had in the fuller days. Still, a thin pottage was far better than none, and the pot still hung over the fire, still gave its warmth and its little goodness. The family ate it, and were grateful for it, and made it last, and looked forward, always, to the spring and the green. For thin as it was food, and warm, and it kept them going through the lean grey days, toward the better time. Edith made the most of what she had, as she always had, coaxing savour from little, stretching the small store far. A good wife's skill showed most in the hungry gap, in the making of a meal from almost nothing, in the eking out of the last. And she did it, day by day, with a tightening care, watching the store, watching the days, willing the spring to come. So the thin pottage simmered, grey and plain, in the late winter cottage, and the family ate it and endured. It was not the good full pottage of the autumn, but it was what the season gave, and it would have to do. And they ate, and were warmed a little, and the long lean days went by, one by one, toward the far green spring. Now the measuring of the food grew more careful than ever, for the store was low, and the spring was not yet near. Edith and Aldwyn counted together what was left, the last of the grain, the dregs of the peas, the ends of the cheese, and they reckoned, with anxious care, how it must be stretched, how little each could have, how long it might be made to last. This was the hard arithmetic of the hungry gap, the setting of so little food against so many days still to come. 2 free now, and the last would be gone before the spring. 2 sparing, and they would grow weak and ill with want. So they judged it fine, the husbandman and the goodwife, parting out the last of the store with a careful hand. There was no shame in it, this careful counting, only the plain hard necessity of a people near the edge of hunger. Every household did it in the lean weeks, and every household knew the anxious looking from the store to the calendar and back. The lengthening of the days was watched and welcomed, for it meant the spring was nearing and the end of the gap. The grain was the last and best defense, for bread and pottage both, and the grain too was now running low. What was left was guarded close, doled out in small measures, made to go as far as ever it could be made to go, and the family ate less, and worked on, and held out, as folk had always held out, against the lean time. So they measured out the last of the store, grain by careful grain, and set their faces toward the coming spring. It was the hardest of the winter's work, this, the making of almost nothing last through the longest weeks. And they did it, as their people always had, with patience and with care, willing the green days to come at last. When the good grain ran low, the bread itself was eked out, made coarser and darker, stretched with whatever could be found, for bread was the staff of life, and a family would do much to have some bread, even a poor and bitter loaf on the board. And so in the hungry gap, the bread was made of bran, and of beans ground to meal, and even, in the worst of times, of acorns. The cracked loaf on the board now was a poor thing, dark and dense and bitter, far from the honest bread of the fuller days. It was made of the bran that in better times went to the beasts, and of ground beans and peas, and what little true grain was left, and in the very hardest years, when even that ran short, folk ground acorns, soaked to take the bitterness out, and bake them into a kind of bread. It was famine bread, this, the bread of the worst times, and no one ate it gladly, but it kept the hunger off. It sat heavy in the belly, and tasted of bran and bitterness, but it was bread of a kind, and it filled, and that was much. A family brought to acorn bread was a family near the edge, and they knew it, and they prayed for the spring. Yet even this poor bread was a kind of triumph of the human will against hunger, the wringing of food from almost nothing. For folk had learned, over long hard ages, how to make even bran and beans and acorns yield a bread that would keep them alive. It was the knowledge of the desperate, passed down through generations, who had known the lean time and survived it. So the cracked, dark loaf sat on the board, bitter and heavy, the bread of the hungry gap, the food of the last weeks. It was not good, and it was not loved, but it was bread, and it kept the worst of the hunger away. And the family ate it, and made it last, and looked toward the spring, when the good grain and the good bread would come again. In the hungry gap, folk went out to forage too, to seek what little the cold land might yield to eke out the failing store. Aldwyn took the boy out into the white fields and the bare woods, to look for what could be found beneath the snow. There was little enough, in the dead of late winter, but a sharp eye and a patient hand might find something to add to the pot. There were roots to be dug, the wild roots that the snow had not killed, bitter and tough, but food for all that. There were the last of the hedgerow's gleanings, a few hard berries clinging on, the inner bark of certain trees, the early shoots where any showed. And there was the snaring of small creatures, a rabbit or a bird, if a man dared and the Lord's law allowed, to bring meat to a meatless house. The boy learned, as they searched, what could be eaten and what could not, the old lore of the forager handed down. Which root was food and which was poison, where the hedgerow hid its last gleanings, how to read the cold land for what it gave. It was a knowledge that might one day save his life, and his father taught it as his father had taught him. It was cold, hard searching for little reward out in the snow and the bare woods of the dying winter. A handful of bitter roots, a few withered haws, a snared rabbit if they were lucky, to add to the thin pottage at home. But every scrap helped. In the lean time, every mouthful foraged was a mouthful that need not come from the dwindling store. So father and son foraged in the white land, heads down, eyes searching, gathering what little there was. It was the last shift of the hungry season, this seeking of food from the wild when the stored food failed. And they carried home their poor handful and added it to the pot and stretched the lean days a little further toward the spring. Back in the cottage, Edith and the boy worked at the eking out of the bread, mixing in what they could to make the grain go further. She ground the foraged roots and the bran and the few beans and mixed them with the last of the true meal to make a dough. It was a poor dough, dark and heavy, but it would bake to a kind of bread, and bread of any kind was wanted now. The boy helped her, as he always did, and learned, without being told, the deep lessons of the lean time. He learned that food was never to be wasted, that everything was to be saved and used, that the store must be made to last. These were lessons that would stay with him all his life, learned in the hunger of a hard late winter by his mother's side. For this was how the poor survived the hungry gap, not by any one great thing, but by 100 small economies. The bread stretched with bran, the pottage thinned with water, the foraged scraps added in, the last of all things made to go far. It was a kind of skill, this surviving on little, a hard-won wisdom that the lean years taught and the people kept. The dark dough was shaped and baked and made its poor bitter bread, and the family ate it and were glad of it. For it was the difference between hunger and worse, and in the lean time that difference was everything. And so they ate the eked-out bread, and the thin pottage, and the foraged scraps, and held out yet a while longer. There was no plenty in it, and no pleasure, only the grim, patient making-do of a people near the edge. But there was endurance in it too, and skill, and the long human stubbornness that does not give in to hunger easily. And the days lengthened, slowly, slowly, and the spring crept nearer, and the lean time neared its end. Let us step outside a moment into the bare white world of the late winter and see the land that gave so little. The fields lay under their old grey snow, hard and silent, and the trees stood black and bare against the pale, cold sky. The kitchen garden by the cottage was a frozen waste, its beds buried, nothing growing, the green of the year still locked away. It was a hard sight, this, to a hungry people, the empty land that would not feed them yet, the long wait for the green, for all the food was in the store, or foraged from the wild, and the land itself gave nothing in these last cold weeks. The fields that would, in time, give grain and greens and roots, lay dead and white, holding their gift back still. But there were signs, for those who knew to look, that the worst was passing and the turn was coming. The days were lengthening, the light lasting longer, the sun climbing a little higher each noon above the bare horizon. And here and there, in a sheltered spot, the very first green of the spring might show, a shoot, a bud, a promise. The folk watched the land closely in these weeks, for every sign of the coming spring, every lengthening of the day. They knew the seasons as we cannot, read them in the light and the air and the first stirrings of the green. And they knew that the white dead land would, in its time, wake again and give and feed them once more. So the bare fields lay under the snow, silent and waiting, holding the spring still locked within them. The cold pressed on, the store ran low, the hungry gap held the village in its grey grip a while longer. But the days were lengthening, and the turn was near, and the white land would, before long, begin to give again. There was a fear in the hungry gap, a quiet fear that lived in every house, the old fear of famine and want. For the people knew, as we have half forgotten, that hunger could kill, that a bad year could empty the store before the spring. And so in the lean weeks, by the low fire, there was an anxiousness in the heart, a counting and a worrying and a hoping. Edith and Aldwyn sat by the sinking fire one evening, the store low, the spring not yet come, and spoke quietly of how it stood. There was enough, they reckoned, with care, to see them through, if no one fell ill and nothing went wrong, to the green days. But it was close, closer than they liked, and they knew that other years had not ended so well for other families. For famine was no stranger to the medieval world, and a run of bad harvests, or a winter too long, could bring real starvation. There were years, the chroniclers remembered, years of great dearth, when folk died of hunger and ate things no one should eat, and every family, in every lean winter, lived with the shadow of that, the knowledge of how thin the margin truly was. Yet they did not give way to the fear, but held it quiet, and went on, and did what could be done. They rationed, and foraged, and eked out, and trusted to the lengthening days and the coming spring, and endured. For there was nothing else to do but endure, and they were a people long practiced in enduring, and they held on. So the husbandman and the goodwife sat by their low fire, and faced the lean time, and did not despair. The fear was there, quiet in the heart, but so was the hope, and the long habit of survival, and the patience of the poor. And they banked the fire, and went to their rest, and held out for one more day toward the spring. In the lean time, The parents went without, that the children might eat, and the boy was given the last good morsel. For it was the way of things, then as now, that the old and the strong gave up their share for the young and the weak. And so when there was a little meat, or a good piece of bread, or a stored apple left, it went most often to the child. Edith gave the boy the last of a stored apple one evening, wrinkled and soft but sweet, the last of the autumn's fruit. She had kept it back, through all the lean weeks, for such a time, for a moment when the boy most needed a little sweetness. And she watched him eat it, his face glad in the firelight, and was content, though she ate only the thin pottage herself. This was the quiet heroism of the hungry gap, the going without of the parents, the saving of the best for the young. It was not spoken of, or made a show of, but it was done, in cottage after cottage, in the lean weeks of every winter. The grown folk grew thin, and the children less so, for the love of the parents stood between the children and the worst. For the children were the future, the hope of the family and the village, and they were guarded even in hunger. A child kept fed through the lean time would grow and work and carry the family on. A child lost was a grief past mending. So the last good morsel went to the boy, and the parents made do with less, and so it had always been. The boy ate his apple, not knowing perhaps the cost of it, the love that had saved it for him through the lean weeks. But he was fed, and he was warm by the fire, and he slept well that night, and that was what his mother wished. And the lean time wore on toward its end, and the family held together, and the worst was, slowly, passing. But now let us turn, at the last, from the lean time to the one great brightness of the medieval winter, the midwinter feast. For in the deepest dark of the year, at Christmas and the days that followed, there came a time of feasting and of plenty. And nowhere was it greater than in the manor hall, where the Lord kept his Christmas, and even the poor had their share. The great hall of the manor was decked, in these days, with boughs of holly and of ivy, the evergreen of the dead season. The long tables were spread, the fires roared, the candles and the rushlights burned, and the hall was bright and warm against the dark. It was the one time of the year when the hall was given over wholly to feasting, when plenty was the rule and want was forgotten. For it was the custom, an old and cherished custom, that the Lord should feast his people at Christmas, the high and the low alike, the tenants and the labourers, who toiled for him all the year, came to the hall in the Christmas days to eat at his board. It was a bond between the Lord and his folk, this feasting, a return for their service, a sharing of plenty in the dark. So the hall was made ready, hung with green, the fires built high, the food made ready in great quantity. The smell of roasting meat filled it, and the warmth of the great fires, and the light of many candles, against the winter night. And the folk gathered in, the great and the small, to eat and drink and be warm together, in the deep midwinter dark. It was a thing to lift the heart, after the long grey winter, this one bright warm feast in the dead of the year, the greenery, the fires, the food, the company, all of it a defiance of the cold and the dark and the long lean months. And the manor hall, decked and bright and warm, was the very heart of it, the great fire of the winter's gloom. In the great kitchen of the manor, the cook Crispin laboured over the roasting fires, making ready the feast. For a feast was a great labour as well as a great pleasure, and the cook and his helpers worked long and hard to make it. And there at the roaring hearth stood Crispin, turning the great spits before the fire, where the meat roasted and dripped and browned. There was roast meat in plenty for the feast, the one time of the year when meat was eaten freely and at its best. Whole joints turned on the spits, and birds, and perhaps a pig or a side of beef, roasting before the great fires, basted and browned. The smell of it filled the kitchen and crept into the hall, rich and savoury, the smell of plenty and of feasting. Crispin turned the spit by hand, or by a boy set to the wearisome turning, that the meat might roast evenly all round. He basted it with its own dripping fat, and judged its doneness by long skill, and saw that it came to the table at its best. It was hot, hard work, before the roaring fire, but it was the work of plenty, and the cook took pride in it. For the feast was the cook's great moment, the showing of his skill, the making of the best the year could give. All his craft went into it, the roasting and the seething and the spicing, the turning of plain food into a feast, and he laboured at it gladly, sweating before the fire, for a feast well made was a thing to be proud of. So Crispin turned the spits, and basted the meat, and the roast grew brown and crisp and ready before the fire. The kitchen was a place of heat and labour and rich smells, the engine of the feast, working at its height. And from it soon would come the roast meat to the hall, the centre of the midwinter feast. In the hall the long tables were laden, as they were laden no other time of the year, with the food of the feast. There were the great platters of roast meat, brought steaming from the kitchen, the centre and the glory of the board. And there was bread in plenty, even the finer bread, and cheese, and what fruits and sweet things the season and the Lord could give. The roast meat was the wonder of it, for the poor ate meat seldom, and roast meat freshly turned from the spit almost never. To sit at a table laden with it, to eat one's fill of hot roast flesh, was a rare and remembered joy for a labouring man. And so the platters went round, and the folk ate, and there was meat enough for once for all to have their share. There was drink too, in plenty, the strong ale, and perhaps some wine for the Lord's table, and the spiced ale for the cold. The cups were filled and filled again, and the warmth of the food and the drink and the fires spread through the hall. It was plenty, real plenty, after the long, lean winter, and the folk ate and drank deep and were glad. The laden table was a sight to lift the heart of a hungry people, a vision of abundance in the dead of the year. After the thin pottage and the bran bread of the lean weeks, here was meat and white bread and sweet things and plenty. It was the feast that all the winter had pointed toward, the one bright meal that made the long dark bearable. So the table stood laden, and the folk ate their fill, and the hall was warm and bright and full of good cheer. There was no thought of the lean time now, no counting of the store, only the plenty of the feast and the joy of it. And the platters went round, and the cups were filled, and the midwinter feast was at its height. Among the best of the feast's good things was the spiced ale, warmed and rich, ladled out in the kitchen and brought to the hall, for the feast was a cold weather feast in the dead of winter, and a warm spiced drink was the very crown of it, and Crispin the cook made it in quantity, in a great pot by the fire, warming the ale and spicing it for all the company. Into the warm ale went the spices that were brought out for the feast, the precious things kept for such a time. There was ginger, perhaps, and cinnamon, and other spices from far away, costly and rare, used freely now for the feast, and honey to sweeten it, and the whole warmed together, till it was a rich and fragrant and heartening drink. This spiced ale was a luxury beyond the common, a taste of far-off lands and of plenty, in the cold of the English winter, for the spices came from the ends of the earth, carried far and sold dear, and the poor tasted them but rarely at such feasts. To drink the warm spiced ale was to taste a richness quite beyond the daily fare, a wonder of the feasting days. Crispin ladled it out, steaming and fragrant, into the cups and the jugs, to be carried to the warm bright hall, and there it went round, the warm spiced ale, and the folk drank it, and felt the warmth and the richness of it. It was the taste of the feast, this, the warm, sweet spiced cup, the very flavour of plenty in the dark. So the spiced ale was made, and warmed, and spiced, and carried to the hall, the crown of the midwinter feast. It cheered the heart, and warmed the body, and gladdened the long cold night, the best of the feasting's good things. And the cups went round, warm and fragrant, in the bright warm hall, in the deep dark of the year. But the feast was not only in the manor hall, for even the poorest cottage kept its own small Christmas in its own small way. And so let us return, at the last, to Edith and Aldwyn and the boy, and see their own midwinter feast by their own fire. For they too, in the dark of the year, set aside the lean fare for a day, and ate the best they had, and were glad. They had kept something back through all the lean weeks, for this, a piece of the good meat, a measure of the better flour. For it was unthinkable not to keep Christmas, not to have some small feast in the dark of the year, however poor the house. So Edith had saved and hoarded and gone without, that there might be a little plenty on this one day, for her family. And now she made the cottage feast, the best she could, the roast or the boiled meat, the good bread, what little extra she had. It was a small feast, beside the manor's, a poor feast, but it was theirs, and it was plenty by their plain measure, and the smell of the good meat filled the little cottage, rich and rare, the smell of feasting in the poor man's house. The family gathered to the board, in the warm firelit room, to eat their Christmas feast together. There was meat, real meat, and good bread, and warm ale, and the fire burned bright, and the room was warm against the dark, and they ate, and were filled, as they had not been filled in many a lean week, and were glad together. It was a small thing, this cottage feast, and a poor one, but it was a brightness in the dark, a plenty after want. For one day the counting and the rationing were set aside, and they ate their fill, and kept the feast, as all folk did. And the warm cottage glowed, and the good smell hung in the air, and the family feasted by their fire in the deep midwinter. The roast meat by the cottage fire was the wonder of the family's feast, for it was meat such as they seldom had, a piece of the good pork saved from the barrel, or a fowl from the yard, roasted before the fire on the hearth. It browned and crisped and dripped, and the smell of it filled the room, and the family watched it with hungry, happy eyes. For roast meat was a rare thing in a poor house, where most of the meat went into the pot, boiled in the pottage. To roast was to use a good piece whole, and to lose the broth of it, a richness a poor house could rarely afford. So a roast was a feast in itself, kept for the great days, and the Christmas roast was the greatest of them all. Edith turned the meat before the fire, and basted it, and judged it done, as the manor cook did with his great spits. It was a smaller thing, her roast, a humble piece before a cottage fire, but the skill was the same, and the joy the greater. And when it was done, she cut it, and shared it out, and the family ate the rare roast meat, and savoured every bite. The boy ate his share with shining eyes, for he tasted roast meat but a few times in all the year, and this was the best. And the husbandman ate his, slow and glad, the good meat a reward for all the long year's labour and the lean winter's want. And the good wife ate hers, content above all to see her family fed and glad on the feast day. So they ate the roast meat by the fire, the rare good meat of the midwinter feast, and were glad and warm together. It was the best meal of all the year, this, the bright centre of the dark season, the plenty after the long want. And the firelight fell on their glad faces, and the good meat was eaten, and the feast was kept by the cottage fire. When the meat was eaten, the warm spiced ale went round the cottage too, shared from cup to cup by the fire. For Edith had her small store of spice kept for this day, and had warmed and spiced the ale as the alewife did. And so the family had their own warm spiced cup, the crown of their own small feast, in the deep of the winter night. The husbandman drank, and the boy had his little warmed cup, and the good wife hers, and they shared the warmth of it. The spiced ale was sweet and warm and rich, a taste of plenty, a luxury for the feast, a comfort in the cold. And they drank it slow, and savoured it, the warmth spreading through them, the firelight glowing in the cups. There was a deep contentment in it, this sharing of the warm cup by the fire, the family close and warm and fed. The long winter was outside, the lean time behind and the spring ahead. But here, now, was warmth and plenty and one another, and they sat close in the firelight, the man and the woman and the boy, content as they had not been content all the long winter. For this was the heart of the feast, in the end, not the food alone, but the warmth and the togetherness of it, the being together, fed and warm, in the dark of the year, the family whole, and close by its own fire. And the warm cup went round, slow and easy, and the firelight glowed, and the night was kind for once. So they shared the warm spiced ale, the family by the fire, in the deep of the midwinter night. It was the sweetest of the feast's good things, this warm shared cup, the warmth of the body and the heart together, and they drank, and were warm, and were glad. And the long dark winter was, for this one night, held far away. When the feast was done, the family sat full and warm by the fire, in a contentment they had not known in many a week. The meat was eaten, the ale was drunk, the fire burned warm, and the long lean want of the winter was, for this night, forgotten. And they sat together in the glowing dark, easy and full and warm, and let the contentment settle over them like a blanket. The boy grew drowsy first, as children do, full of the good meat and the warm ale, his eyes heavy in the firelight. He leaned against his mother, and his lids drooped, and the warmth and the fullness drew him gently down towards sleep. And Edith held him, and let him drowse, content above all things to see her child fed and warm and at peace. The husbandman sat staring into the fire, full and easy, his hard year's labour and the lean winter's want set aside for the night. There was nothing to do now, no work, no worry, only the sitting by the fire, full and warm, in the deep midwinter dark, and he let the contentment hold him, the rare ease of a full belly and a warm fire, and his family close about him. It was a quiet happiness, this, the simplest and the deepest, the happiness of being fed and warm and together. After the long grey winter, after the lean and anxious weeks, here was plenty, and warmth, and rest, and one another. And they savoured it, the family by the fire, this one bright warm night in the heart of the dark. So they sat, full and warm and content, as the fire burned low, and the night deepened outside. The feast was kept, the plenty enjoyed, the long want forgotten for a night, and the family whole and glad together. And the warmth held them, and the firelight glowed, and slowly, gently, the long good night drew on towards sleep. Let us look, as the feast winds down, at the table where the plenty has been, now quiet in the falling firelight. The platters are empty, or near so, the good meat eaten, the bread broken and shared, the cups drained and still. The greenery hangs on the wall, the holly and the ivy, dark and glossy in the glow, the green of the dead season. It is a table at rest now, the feast done, the plenty enjoyed, the labour of the cook and the good wife rewarded. The candles burn low, the rushlights gutter, the great fires sink toward embers, the bright hall and the warm cottage growing dim. And over it all hangs the good smell of the feast, of roast meat and spiced ale and wood smoke, the smell of plenty in the dark. After the long lean winter, the feast has come and gone, one bright meal in the heart of the cold, and it was good. The folk are fed, the want forgotten for a night, the dark of the year defied with food and fire and company. And now the feast settles into rest, the table quiet, the fire low, the long good night drawing on. There is a deep peace in a feast well kept and ended, the plenty enjoyed, the gladness had, the company warm. The work is done, the food is eaten, the cups are drained, and there is nothing left but to sit and rest and grow drowsy. And the feast table rests in the falling light, the greenery dark, the embers glowing, the night kind and still. So the midwinter feast comes to its quiet end, in the manor hall and the cottage alike, the plenty enjoyed and done. The long winter is not over, and the lean weeks will come again before the spring. But for this night there was plenty, and the table rests, and the fire sinks, and the warm dark gathers, and the feast draws gently toward sleep. The fire that roared so bright for the feast now sinks toward embers, glowing soft and red in the deepening dark. The great flames are gone, the roasting done, the warmth still in the room but gentler now, the light grown dim and rosy, and the embers settle and glow, and shift and sink, the last warmth of the feast, the fire going quietly to its rest. There is a deep quiet now, after the feast, the hall grown still, the cottage hushed, the folk grown drowsy by the fire. The talk has faded, the laughter stilled, the cups set down, and there is only the soft settling of the embers in the dark. The long bright feast has burned down, like the fire, to a warm and glowing rest, the plenty enjoyed and now at peace. The good smell lingers still, faint now, of roast meat and spiced ale and wood smoke, the memory of the feast in the air. And the warmth lingers too, held in the walls, held in the bodies of the drowsy folk, held in the glowing embers. It is the gentlest part of the feast, this, the warm quiet after, the sinking toward rest, the long good night. The embers glow and sink, and the dark grows deeper, and the folk grow drowsier, and sleep draws near. The feast is over, the plenty had, the dark of the year defied for a night, and now comes the rest, the deep, warm sleep. And the embers settle, soft and red, the last of the feast's fire, glowing low into the quiet dark. So the great fire of the feast sinks to embers, and the warm dark gathers, and the long good night deepens towards sleep. The plenty is enjoyed, the feast is kept, the dark is held away, and now there is only the warm quiet and the sinking fire, and the embers glow, soft and low and red, in the deep still dark of the midwinter night. And so the great winter goes on, as it has gone on for centuries, with its salting and its storing and its slow, careful eating. The meat lies in the barrel, the bread cools on the shelf, the pottage simmers low, the embers sink toward their rest. The feast is kept and ended, the plenty had, the long dark held away for a night, and now the village settles into sleep. In the cottages, the fires are banked low, the doors are barred, the folk lie down warm beneath their blankets and their furs. The snow lies soft and grey over the fields and the lanes, and the smoke rises thin from the roofs into the still cold air. And the long winter night closes over the sleeping village, quiet and deep, as it has closed 1,000 times before. The fire burns low, the village sleeps, and perhaps, by now, so do you. If you are still awake, that is perfectly fine. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, and the long warm night is yours to rest in. Let the salting and the storing and the slow careful eating drift away, and let your breathing slow and soften and deepen. The archive will be here tomorrow night, as always, with another quiet corner of the past to wander through. But for now, there is only the warm dark and the sinking fire and the soft grey snow over the sleeping fields. Sleep well,